This week we are covering watersheds, fish, hydrology, and habitat. We have two speakers who are going to touch on that. Joining us from the Monmouth and Corvallis watch parties. Our first speaker today is a fish fish biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Brian Bangs. And yeah, I will stop sharing my screen and let Lady Corvallis take over.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Okay.
Okay, am I muted still?
Nope.
Okay.
Don't believe so.
Can I move this up towards me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have my mouse.
Ooh, lucky me. Okay, hi everybody online. Hi everybody in the room. Next slide, I guess. I'm Brian Bangs. I'm an aquatic ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm went too far on my slides. Um, I primarily work with native non-game species. So lots of fish that you guys have probably never heard about are I spend most of my time on. Probably the most interesting thing I work on is beaver and bull trout. Here locally, I'm one of the experts on Oregon chub, which was the first fish that was recovered off the Endangered Species Act. Um, I grew up here in the valley. My family had a beef cattle farm right along Fernridge Lake, and grew up there. Didn't make it too far from my home waters, coming up here to Corvallis. So, happy to talk today with you guys about fish and aquatic species and habitat. I need to put the little thing up here. My boss said, make sure you give them some sort of a like, hey, this isn't the opinion of Fish and Wildlife Service if you're saying something wonky. So I have to say that. But happy to answer any questions as they come in, especially if it's something that you guys need some clarification on, or if I happen to accidentally use jargon or something you don't understand, stop me and I will gladly. But if you guys have more in-depth questions, let's save them towards the end, just so I keep my flow going, because otherwise I'll just lose my train of thought. So here's what's in store for my presentation today. I want to go through and just give kind of a background, like 50,000 foot elevation look at the Willamette River Basin, history, some processes. I want to talk a little bit about riverine processes, especially how they relate to habitat. Chris, the next guy up here, is going to be talking more about riverine processes in more detail. I want to talk about riparian habitat and connectivity and kind of how one of the main parts of my talk is about restoring connectivity and the importance of that. And then I'm going to go dive deep into some species, talk about specific species, aquatic species, and amphibian species as well, and reptile, and talk about how those relate to aquatic habitats and how you guys might want to be thinking about them as you're looking at your properties. Next, I'll go into a quick synthesis of kind of watershed condition restoration goals on a sample property. And I have some more information here for further reading for you guys if you're interested. So this is the 50,000 foot goal, maybe 50,000 foot, probably more like 120,000 feet if we're at this level. But we're in the Willamette River Basin. It's obviously in the lower left-hand corner of the screen on Oregon here, part of the larger Columbia River Basin, a relatively small part of the overall Columbia River Basin. There's a lot of the Oregon history, I think, when I talk to people about Oregon and the Willamette River, that people don't really realize. And the Willamette River used to not exist, right? We had a Cascade Range, we had a coastline, and at one point in time, no coastal foothills. And our rivers drain straight over into the coast, much like the Umpqua does today. So about 5-ish million years ago, the coastal plains started to uplift. And with this uplift, oops, I'm going ahead of myself. Well, the little thing's not there. Maybe let me back up a second here. The Cascades, primarily volcanic rock, primarily harder volcanic rock. The coastal plain, the original coastal plain, mostly sedimentary rock, softer rock. These are very different the way they break down and the kind of habitats they create. These basins, as they drained westward, were also pretty stinking wide. They had the entire force of these large rivers behind them. So tectonic uplift occurs on the coastal plain. It creates the coastal foothills. I just have that red line right about there where the uplift happened. when this started happening, it bisected our rivers. So what was the Alsea became the Alsea on one side and the Marys on the other side. Maybe it's a lucky mute at that level. Same thing happened with Siletz and Yaquina and the other large coastal basins all broke off from our Willamette River basins. And we had a smaller basin that then switched directions and started flowing inward and towards the center of the valley, and what was now a valley because of the uplift of the coastal plain. That's where the Willamette River comes from. That's how the Willamette River is born, is from this interesting, curious little history of Western Oregon and how we evolved. And you can imagine at the time we had fish species in all of these rivers. All these rivers had fish species in them. Basalt flows covered up most of northern Oregon, the northern Oregon coast, and also the southern Oregon coast. And so a lot of the fish that were in these rivers are now gone. And the only ones where they remain are the Umpqua and the Siuslaw, which still have a lot of the same fish that we have here in the Willamette. The rest of them are boiled up in lava, I guess. So it's just an interesting little tidbit about Western Oregon and the way you think about where your property might sit on this history. Because the aquatic species, these habitats, are much older than people kind of give them credit for when thinking about, well, what did habitat look like and how is this habitat made? Another big part of how this habitat made was during the last glaciation period, the Missoula floods. And so there was, as the glaciers receded around Missoula, Montana, large lakes formed that were had dams on them built up of ice and glaciers. These broke free, scoured out the southeastern scablands of Washington, rushed through and created the Columbia Valley, and then backfilled into the Willamette Valley. Brought in a ton of sediment. A lot of the good sediment that's our farmland today was brought in during these big Missoula flood events and deposited during those big Missoula flood events. It also brought with them one of our fish, the sand roller, as one of our local native fish, actually was a Mississippi transplant. It was brought over during that big flood event. Happens to be now in the Columbia Basin. It's one of a few fish that has an adipose fin that is not a salmon. So one of my favorites. I'd like to talk briefly about rivers. I go into these kind of talks and I'm like, well, gosh, I know that I don't know a lot of things about a lot of things. And I'm like, well, maybe I wonder how people think about rivers. And so as we think about rivers, we start in coastal foothills, we start in mountain processes with smaller tributaries. These tributaries, as they combine with each other, get larger and larger and larger. Rivers build energy. And as they come down through these foothills or through the mountains, once they hit a valley, typically slow down. And that energy has to go somewhere. Energy oftentimes will be scouring out and making meanders and kind of these fluvial processes. I think Chris is going to go into more of that during his talk. But these processes are kind of universal in some ways, where we have rivers that are formed up in headwaters. They gather energy, and as they come together, they kind of go through the same processes no matter where you're at. And there's this idea called the river continuum concept. It's a model. It's not a perfect model by any means. And I think Chris is probably also going to talk about that. Chris, I saw this slide is in your slides, and I'm sorry that I'm probably stealing a little bit of your thunder, but it's not a perfect way of thinking about rivers, but it's a useful way of thinking about rivers. And at least I find it to be a useful way of thinking about rivers. That when you are in the tributaries or the smaller streams, which is on the top part of this image, your rivers and streams are typically shaded out with riparian vegetation. They're small, typically cooler, typically not as wide, typically not as deep. A lot of the material that's entering the rivers at that time are leaves. And we call them block-less inputs. They're inputs coming in from outside the river and dropping in. As you go downstream, rivers typically get wider, deeper, warmer. And a lot of that material, the coarse material like leaves, is broken down. So a lot of the insects that are in that upper river are different from insects that are in the mid-river and the lower river. At the same time, plant communities change. The in-water plant communities change as you go from headwaters to mid reaches and to lower reaches. And so, at least in Western Oregon, I find this a very useful way of thinking about rivers. The fish communities and the other aquatic communities also rank themselves on the same way. If I go to an area that I've not been before, but I know generally the size of where it's at, the size of the catchment, how much water is there, what kind of riparian vegetation's that I can kind of predict. And I'm not perfect, obviously, but I can kind of predict what kind of species I might expect there. It's kind of consider the river continuum process, a way of kind of thinking about this. And I'm going to get away from it for a little bit, but we'll tie back in to this further on in the talk. So talking more about the Willamette. Since the 1850s, the Willamette has changed dramatically. And especially as lower as you get to the floodplain, the more the Willamette has really changed. There's been an overall simplification of the hydraulic processes of the Willamette River. It used to be the Willamette was not a single-threaded channel, but it was a multi-threaded channel. And the channel moved laterally across the floodplain all the time. And very common for it to move. Now, obviously, as people bought property, they didn't necessarily want their property line moving or fields washed away. They wanted to farm that property. People wanted to build roads and infrastructure, railroads. At one point, there was stern wheel paddle boats going up and down the Willamette River, taking products up and down the river. They wanted a single deep channel that was relatively stable to get movement up and down the river and to keep the channel from moving. So there's overall simplification of the Willamette River. The bank stabilization, putting in revetments and dikes, large wood removals, actually pulling out the large wood that would shunt water sideways in the channel, dredging the Willamette, putting spoils outside of it to get ships up and down, conversion of riparian forests. A lot of this area was forested, and they cleared that back for agriculture, and also, like I say, the road and railroad construction. So had profound impacts on the amount and kinds of habitat in the river. Oops, sorry guys, my keyboard's a little finicky. You can see a lot of this today. So this is a LiDAR image. It's basically a laser image taken from an airplane looking at the landscape. And you can see the relics of how much movement used to be in the Willamette River by looking at some of these LiDAR images and seeing all these old channels. This is the spot in the lower Mackenzie River, and this is the Mackenzie River right here. And I work in a spot here. It's called Mackenzie Oxbow, kind of it's about 10 miles upstream of Springfield. And neat little beaver pond, neat little slough. This was at one point in near history, maybe in the 60s, this was the main stem Mackenzie River. And it moved banks and came over this way and left behind this relic side channel. These side channels, super important for diversity in the river. I'll go into them in more depth in just a minute, but you can see this and across this landscape at this point here, how many times this channel has moved in history to leave behind all these scars behind on them. So a big part of this, I talked about the simplification of the main stem river, was also construction of the dams and the reservoirs. The flood control dams started getting built in the 1940s. The last one was built in the mid to late 60s. And there's 13 flood control dams. And the primary purpose is the safety of humans and protection of property, stabilization of river flows coming down. There's a number of purposes: irrigation, fish, and a bunch of other things too. But primarily, it's to control large flood events. So before these dams came in, large floods would come through, and the town Corvallis obviously used to be Orleans across the river. That town was wiped off the map by a large flood. The state capital at Champouig was wiped off the map at one point, and the capital moved to Salem. So the floods had major effect back in the day, which is why they built these dams. A number of these things do power generation as well, but they have huge impacts to the geology, the hydrology of our system. They stop peak flows from happening, and these flows alter connectivity through the system, lateral connectivity through the system. These flows had energy to them that maintained and created channel habitats. And so without them, we further simplified the processes that were driving habitat creation. They arrest sediment. So all the sediment that's coming downstream out of these big tributaries out of, and I should note these are all primarily on the Cascades draining tributaries, except for Long Tom at Furnish Dam. And so, sediment gets trapped behind these, and in some cases, 60 years of sediment trapped behind these dams that is not going downriver. So as water moving downriver continues to avulse habitat, move sediment downstream with high flows, it's not being replaced, which is very unnatural. So this has huge impacts to our fish. It alters connectivity. Many of these dams don't have fish passage at them, or have poor fish passage at them. It's something we're trying to improve all the time. In the reservoirs themselves, these habitats are pretty stable. They're just big ponds. So a lot of the Midwest sport fish that people brought out as Europeans colonized the Willamette Valley do very well in these habitats. And the predation is high in the reservoirs. And like I say, they impact fluvial processes, sediment transport, water temperature. Inside these dams are big open reservoirs, so water tends to heat up inside of them, and the timing of water coming downstream and the temperature is different, and changes our hydrograph. The kind of how the seasonality of water moving downstream is highly changed. So obviously, this isn't always perfect. I think this was the 1996 flood event around Harrisburg, and sometimes we get too much water come downstream, even for the dams to control, and we do have these flood events. You can see at least a tiny snapshot of what the Willamette River used to look like when these big floods happen, and you see these channels fill back up with water, and you say, "Oh wow!" At one point, there was an awful lot of water laterally on this landscape that's now not here. So I want to talk a bit about freshwater habitats. Freshwater habitats in the Willamette are extremely diverse. I talked a bit about how these habitats came to be. I want to talk a bit about diversity for a second. So when I talk about freshwater habitats, I think most people think of this. They think of cool water streams and babbling brooks and that kind of stuff. So what does make fish habitat? Good fish habitat. I think a lot of people would default to like kind of our most stringent habitat requirements for fish, and the bull trout right here, probably the fish that has the most like strict habitat requirements in the basin. They need really cold water. They spawn at around 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the fall. They rear, just below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The max tolerance. This is where these fish start to like turn over and croak. 64 degrees. Still pretty stinking cold. Given what temperatures can get to. They also have a ton of other requirements. Clean water. They need connectivity upstream, downstream. They have to have forage fish available to them. Complex habitat. They have a lot of needs. So if meeting all these needs, does that make good fish habitat? Well, no, not necessarily. There's 69 species of fish in the Willamette River. About half of them are native. 36 of them are native. 33 of them are non-native species currently. They all have their own niches, basically. They all have their own habitat needs and their own little parts of the valley that they evolved to. Some of them, like the Oregon chub I mentioned earlier, is endemic. It's only found here in the Willamette River, found nowhere else in the world, and it evolved to our kinds of habitats. Other of these fishes are very specialized and specialize in certain types of habitats. Sticklebacks in the right lower corner there, cousin of the seahorse. You can find them in the lower river. You can find them up in the tributaries. They like weedy, warm habitats, warmer than you ever look at and say, oh, that's fish habitat. The one in the upper left-hand corner is a chiselmouth chub. It's a big fish. You can't see it in this picture, but it has a little chisel on its lower lip, and it goes around scraping insects off of rocks. And it does well in fast-moving deep water. And so, to say, well, what is good habitat for fish is a human invention, because fish have evolved to all the diversity of habitats in the Willamette River, not just the ones that we look at and say, this is pristine. And so if you get nothing out of this talk besides that idea that all habitats don't have to be salmon habitats, I've done my job. But so this is one of my favorite spots in the world. It's called Duggan Slough. It's up on the Middle Fork Willamette River. It's a swamp. And it is a rearing habitat for Chinook and steelhead when they're coming through the valley. Secondary channel. If you kept walking up this, would bend around to the right, and left, and you would end up, about a mile upstream where it connects back into the river. Just a little secondary channel. 60 years ago, 100 years ago, this was the Middle Fork Willamette River at one point, and it obviously has meandered over and diverted. During high flow events, behind me is the rest of the Middle Fork Willamette River, a big river. And during high flow events, very big peak flows, floods, water's ripping in the river behind me. But this stays relatively slack water. The water velocity is relatively low. This is a place where juvenile salmon, where trout, during those kind of peak flow events, have to go to, has to be available for them to kind of weather the storm of nasty conditions. Habitats like this tend to be a little bit cooler than the main stem river midsummer, just because water is slowly kind of eking out from floodplain habitats into them. So this is a place during hot water events that fish will go to weather those storms. Without this kind of diversity in habitat, we would have overall less productivity in our river. I think I kind of scanned through a couple more habitats. Here's a swamp on the North Santiam, a beautiful spot full of Oregon chub, also full of steelhead, juvenile steelhead, and juvenile Chinook sometimes of the year. It's not one that people would look at and say, there's a Chinook habitat. This is one on the Marys River, down over near Star Creek, and a beautiful wetland home to about 90,000 Oregon chub, western pond turtles, red-legged frogs, a bunch of other cool animals live here. It has a family of otter that go out and hunt bullfrogs religiously in this pond. It's a really neat spot, but a lot of people wouldn't look at this and say, this is pristine habitat. So I encourage you to kind of open your minds about what habitat should look like. And as we're going through this, and this is kind of my little push here, the diversity of our Willamette Basin fish fauna is a reflection of our habitat diversity. Habitats also change a lot over time. And so this is a spot in the North Santiam here, a private pond that I've done a bunch of work on. And on the left is fall condition. When water has come back into Willamette Valley, you've got a bunch of rainwater. There's quite a bit of habitat here and quite a bit of water available. The right image is what the summer looks like. And if you can't tell, there's an outline here of here's what the aquatic habitat is available. This supports resident fish year round. And even on the condition on the right, this habitat's super important for steelhead, for cutthroat trout, for Chinook salmon. They're still using this come midsummer because of what water temperatures are doing in the main stem river. And when floods are flushing down the river and flushing a bunch of sediment and silt, fish nose into this to protect themselves. Here's a spot on the Middle Fork Willamette. Again, this is basically the first off-channel habitat you get to below the dams, if that makes any sense. It's nasty. It's a nasty swamp. Super productive habitat. A lot of juvenile salmonids rear inside this habitat. So what I'm encouraging is a variety, a diversity of habitats that help support our ecological, or hydrological processes around the Willamette. Habitat diversity, not just biodiversity, but habitat diversity is something I really push for. And for restoration, setting realistic goals and assessments and having a better understanding of what kind of our landscape level needs of habitats is really important to me. So I'll kind of dive into that a little bit for the rest of the talk here. So I want to talk a bit about what makes a river. What is a river? When fish biologists like Chris and I are looking at it, well, you have a stream channel, and that's on the bottom here. Basically, your summer stream channel, and that is not what the river is to me. The river is the entire floodplain habitat around this stream channel. We consider stream channels during summer levels are pretty low. During winters, we have what we call a bank full depth. And that's basically when waters come back, how much water would you expect on an average high flow event to come down that stream? In the Willamette, that's usually about a foot or two higher than the blackberries. That makes any sense to anybody. Usually to find this, I have to wander back into some blackberries to get into this kind of habitat. It's usually where more perennial vegetation comes in. Below this, you get a lot of scour, and it's wet for quite a bit of year, so it has certain types of vegetation that live within that floodplain riparian zone. Past the bankful, you get deciduous trees, conifers, other kind of permanent vegetation. But typically, this is within what we call a topographic floodplain. So on the landscape, the floodplain is even broader. And that floodplain is when this channel had enough energy to meander laterally across the floodplain. That's the floodplain it had to meander across. That's our topographic floodplain. So I think about rivers in different ways. Yes, we have the stream channel. Yes, we have this idea that the river goes up and down, and there's a riparian zone and a bankfull zone. But then you also look broader and say, okay, what's the floodplain of this thing look like? And in restored condition, how would this work? I mentioned riparian zone, and I'm sorry, I'm using a technical, maybe this is a technical term, I don't know. But riparian zone is just the interface between terrestrial and aquatic habitat. That's all it means. They're typically minor on the landscape. They're typically just one little area in a big valley. They're just one little zone, but typically that's the zone that's highly productive and has the highest species biodiversity. And so they're important areas for biologists to get into because of what they contain within them. They're productive. A lot of how do I use the word besides productivity? A lot of energy is being transferred within these zones, and a lot of nutrients are being uptaken within these zones. They provide shade, cools temperatures. They provide cover, cover actually over the stream, which helps prevent predation for aquatic organisms. They provide trees. So trees fall into the river from the riparian zone. Those trees can move the channel around. Chris, I think, is going to go in more into that, but also provide complexity and cover for fish and other organisms. Nutrients, leaves falling in, animals falling in. A lot of areas, animals falling in from the riparian zone are a primary food source for fish and other aquatic critters, spiders and ants and things like this. And then it's also a barrier. I don't think I finished my thought there. So it's a barrier between more terrestrial inputs and the river. So they act a little bit like sponges. So nutrients coming down from hill slopes or chemicals coming down from hill slopes will be stopped and slowed down by that riparian zone, which helps kind of diffuse those contaminants and lessen their impact. So intact riparian zones provide a host of beneficial and complex ecological functions. I'm not going to go into all of them here. I think I'm going into one of them here, which is nutrient cycling. And I'm going to keep this pretty brief, I think. You imagine, and I know Chris is going to say this in his talk, streams aren't they aren't like channels, right? Streams tend to be complex habitats, riffle and pool sequences that tend to accumulate materials. Humans oftentimes would like streams to be channels. Water goes into them, it immediately flushes downstream as fast as possible. We get it downstream as fast and out to the sea as fast as possible, so we can do what we want to on the land. And rivers don't act like that, obviously. So nutrient cycling is one of the ways it's beneficial for these riparian zones. Basically, the ecological interactions between the stream bed, so the subsurface of the stream bed, the riparian zone vegetation and organisms. It's all one big kind of dance that happens in streams where nutrients are recycled. And so nutrients that come into these systems don't necessarily flush downstream. In complex rivers, nutrients come in, it's uptaken by phytoplankton, which is eaten by larger insects. Those insects are consumed by fish. Those fish are consumed by birds and otters and other things. They die. They get pooped out. That goes to feed trees, which kind of starts the cycle all over again. It's what we call nutrient cycling. And you kind of think of this as a corkscrew. Nutrients go downstream, but where riparian zones are complete, where they're complex, and where streams are complex, this happens very slowly. And so you keep nutrients kind of in your system, and it slowly moves them downstream. In areas where channels aren't as complex, where they're more gutters, and you don't have riparian vegetation, these nutrients just go right downstream, and they're not kept in these home waters. So microhabitats. So I started this talk. I said, hey, here's the Columbia River Basin, and hey, here's the Willamette River Basin, and now we talked a bit about streams, microhabitats. So these are tiny locations on the landscape that provide a huge benefit to species. Things like an undercut bank, where water has scoured underneath the root ball of a tree on the side of a bank and made an undercut bank. They can be of colossal importance to species on the landscape. Um, Things like where secondary channels were on the landscape previously, you may not even see them at this point because sediment has covered them up and they've kind of changed. Well, those old flow pathways still exist on the landscape. We see them on the LiDAR image where these old flow pathways were. Water still moves through them. And that water moves really, really slowly and it cools in these locations. And so they create these springs, seeps, little tributary flows that provide cool water at different portions of the year. I talked about secondary channels, which cause are refuge high flow events. They're kind of nurseries for young salmonids as they come downstream. Super important. Other habitat features, backwaters and alcoves, they provide a diversity of habitat. So fish and other organisms get to choose where they're at different times of the year. And there's this concept called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And so the idea here is in situations where there's low disturbance, and by disturbance, it can be anything. Floods, it can be fire, it can be changing water elevations, it can be high flows. This is all disturbance, right? In areas where there's low disturbance, competition and predation tend to rule the day. So the species that are the most competitive or the most predatory tend to win out, and they kind of outcompete everything else in an environment. Now, disturbance can go way too far. Let's say you have a flood every year, or a fire every year, or something that has huge disturbance all the time. Areas of high disturbance, only like the strongest will survive. The most resilient things on the landscape will make it. Everything else gets wiped out. So the areas where disturbance is intermediate is typically the areas where we find the highest biodiversity. And so we encourage things then, like floods or lateral channel migration, or the creation of new habitats, or wood falling in the stream, or other things that are disturbances, because it helps promote these processes which increase species diversity. So I have in here, it's just a continuing shifting mosaic of habitat conditions. Habitat should always be shifting and changing. That helps species colonization and replacement over other species. And so I'm going to go into this briefly just because it comes up later in the talk, but I kind of mentioned it elsewhere. But this upper right hand image here, where you have a floodplain that meanders around a valley. It didn't work for a lot of people. And I think a lot of our habitats in the valley at one point or another look like the right, where someone has gone through and they ditch it and they simplify it. Well, you can imagine energy coming down this system has a lot more energy entering the top of that image on the right-hand side of the screen than it does on the left. A lot more energy can just flow down that channel, create more shear stresses, which can then lead to down cutting. And so in the Willamette now, we have lots of areas, old farm fields especially, where channels are incised, they're down cut, and they don't interact as much with the floodplain as they once did. And this is a connectivity problem, because where we don't interact with the floodplain, fish, other species can't go out into that floodplain and use that habitat during times of the year they normally would. So those are barriers of connectivity. There's other barriers of connectivity, I think, that are probably a little bit more apparent. Perched culverts. Some fish can jump up a perched culvert, get upstream. A lot of fish can't. Other things like the large dams, they are barriers to connectivity, and they're worth thinking about as we're thinking about these kind of habitat processes on the landscape. Other ones are lateral barriers of connectivity. This, I believe it's somewhere downstream of Corvallis back in the 1930s. And you can still find these, if you float down the river, you can still see these cars out there. There's some of these old 1920 Model A's bodies and stuff still sitting out there. And in some parts, they are destroyed, but the bodies are out there. People have tried hard for a long time to keep the water from moving, or the channel from migrating laterally across the floodplain. Nowadays, we do it more through, more structured things like this wall of boulders here. But it's also a barrier. You can imagine if you are a turtle trying to climb up this, might be kind of difficult. And so these are barriers to connectivity to certain types of organisms. So now I'm going to go through a couple examples of these organisms, just sort of talk it out a bit about what are some of their characteristics and what are some of their limiting factors to think about as you're assessing your own land. I think I have 4, and I'm seeing that I'm 30 something odd minutes into my talk, so I'll try to go through it pretty quickly here. But first one's coastal cutthroat trout. It's such a cool fish. It is found everywhere in the Willamette Valley. It's typically one of the first fish you encounter in the headwater streams, little tiny creeks. I've seen them out in farmers' fields that have cattle on them 9 months of the year, but happen to get water in during the winter. And cutthroat will be running up and down those things for spawning and for just rearing, for getting the normally terrestrial fish that are now flooded in those kind of habitats. Found throughout the Willamette, they're generally short-lived. They have broad distribution. Um, they've been, observed to move some short distances to kind of stay within their preferred temperatures. So they're always on the move to kind of stay within this little band of temperatures. Their comfort zone. If for us it might be like 70 degrees, for them it's 15°C, but they stay right within that little band of their preferred temperature. They have two main life histories. One is a resident life history where they don't really move. They kind of stay put in the habitats where they respond. The other one's migratory, and we call it a fluvial life history, where they'll start out in a little stream, they'll run downstream to the main stem rivers, and use those. They have more inputs, more bugs essentially to grow pretty large, and then annually they'll migrate back upstream into their headwaters as temperatures increase. In the coastal basins like the Alsea and down Umpqua, we have coastal cutthroat that actually are anadromous that go out to the ocean and will actually rear out in the ocean before turning around and coming back into the headwaters. Those ones get even larger. And apparently this is all volitional. So not every one of these fish, from the same red, from the same parents, would necessarily go downstream. Some may stay put, some would go downstream. They spawn in relatively shallow, small, low velocity, low gradient streams. Riffles, tails of pools, things that have about pea-sized gravel in them is their preferred spawning habitat. Tend to spawn late winter through spring. So February is kind of their peak spawning period. And you can think about, like in a normal year at least, what would be wet right now that could have that size of gravel. It's a pretty small habitat in some areas. The juveniles, they typically rear in streams with dense canopy cover. So dense riparian zones is typically where they're at. Cool water temperatures, they have where there's large wood present. They like to hide out underneath large wood, under boulders, especially during summer months when it's warm. They'll actually kind of just nose under boulders and wood and just wait out the summer until better conditions appear. They like areas that have deep pools as well when they're available. Adults, like I say, they're wildly diverse. Some stay within about 700 feet of where they're born. Others make 30-plus-mile routes downriver, at least in the Willamette, and others make even larger distances down to the ocean in those habitats. So upstream movement occurs year-round. It peaks in about July and August. Now, think about what the Willamette looks like and the tributaries look like in July and August. Low flows. Any kind of culvert or any kind of barrier usually has very little water running over it during those times of year, and those become barriers to these fish. So limiting factors. I'm going to have limiting factors, I think, for every species here, but habitat connectivity, habitat loss and conversion of habitats for agriculture, for farm use, degradation of habitats, poor water quality and changes to the hydrograph, basically annual water cycles, predation by an invasive species, and kind of that loss of riparian condition and the loss of in-stream wood and complexity of channels. Simplification. We see wood drop and we see it as a problem. Streams see it as a good thing. Next, we'll talk about lamprey. And lamprey are awesome. Tell me of an older fish. I'd love to hear it. 360 million years old. The word lamprey, Latin is lamprey is lick, and petra means stone. Lampetra is the name, so lick stone. They grab onto rocks with their mouth and move them around to make reds. Very, very cool species. They're a jawless fish, so they have no bottom jaw. Just have one oral sucking disc mouth to grab onto things. There's one at the bottom of the fish ladder. You can see this is a Pacific lamprey, which are parasitic when they're in the ocean, when they're in their anadromous form, and they use those jaws to grab onto fish and suck blood and whatever else they can get a hold of. They have a filter feeding, and they're anadromous, so they come back to fresh water to spawn and rear. And they have a filter feeding larval stage that lasts 6 to 10 years. They're actually in fresh water, which is kind of where we mostly interact with them. We have this, I was kind of copying and pasting slides. This is actually not true anymore. We have two types of lamprey here in Western Oregon. It used to be three. We used to have this Western river lamprey, but recent information has shown that it's just a species of Western brook lamprey. These are the two kind of life diversities of this one species. So the slide's wrong. I just have to mention it because someone's going to know it. But basically, we have two types of lamprey: Pacific lamprey, which can get pretty large. I've seen them, up to like 3 feet ish, maybe a little smaller than that, but big. And the Western brook lamprey, which is much, much smaller. Western brook lampreys are sort of ubiquitous. You find them in lots and lots of locations. This is the range of lamprey in Oregon. You can see here, historical distribution is in red. Areas where they were historically distributed and not now are typically upstream of dams. So lamprey don't do well at our high head dams. We're getting over our high head dams. We're working on it. We're trying to get people to incorporate lamprey passage into fish passage at dams, but haven't got there quite yet everywhere. They can see them in lots and lots of locations. I find lamprey showing up almost everywhere. So they're in even small tribs. You can find these specific lampreys. Brook lampreys, so that's river lamprey. I guess it's also brook lamprey. Brook lampreys have an even broader distribution. You find them in lots and lots of habitats. And so even smaller tributaries of Pacific lampreys, and they're kind of hard to see because, of course, they bury in the substrate. So you can go out to a stream, has a trickle of water, and you have no idea if there's a lamprey down there. It's not like a clam on the beach where you see little siphon holes come up. There's nothing. And so it's really hard to tell if they're there. This is the life cycle. They're free swimming adult. They lay eggs and create larvae in substrate for up to 10 years. From there, they migrate out towards the ocean. This is, of course, for Pacific lamprey, where they become a parasite, and they'll be parasitic. Oh, I did. See, I didn't realize I had these transitions. Larvae for 10 years. 1 year, they're a juvenile as they kind of out-migrate towards the ocean. Once they hit juvenile, they'll go anadromous and 1 to 4 years out in the ocean, and then come back as an adult. And they oftentimes spend 1 year in freshwater as an adult, just hanging out. Like they kind of wait until everyone comes back. We've seen them come back in May and then not start spawning until the next April. We have no idea why. At least I've never heard a good reason why they do this, but they end up losing a lot of weight during that time. They don't feed during that time. So they just sit there very patiently waiting for mates to come back. It's probably not super effective for them. They like lots of different habitats. This is some work that Luke Schultz, a biologist doing work in the Willamette, put together a couple of years ago. But you can see they prefer the Amices prefer off-channel habitats. So these kind of muddy, mucky, swampy habitats that we oftentimes kind of look past had the most lamprey in them in his surveys. But they also use riffle and pool habitat as well. They're not absent from those habitats. So found in lots of different areas in the Willamette. And important, these were first food for the Native American folks, indigenous tribes here locally. And they also filter feed. So stuff that's organics that are moving in the river channel, they're pulling them out and feeding on them. So it's a way of somewhat cleaning waters. So some conservation considerations: lampreys don't jump. They have an oral sucking disc. So a perched culvert doesn't work for a lamprey that can, other fish might be able to jump over. But if it's a slide, they can climb up it with their mouth. So it's a very interesting feature of lamprey. They can get over some barriers that are total passage barriers for some fish, but there's some really simple barriers that don't work for them because they can't jump over these things. They are not as super tolerant to thermal changes. There's some temperatures that are bad for them here locally, and changes in contamination like DOPH, ammonia in water, high turbidity will sometimes kill them off. One of the worst things is we oftentimes just don't know they're there. We'll go to pull out a culvert and not realize that lamprey are above it, and then we start de-water their pond or de-water pool, and the lamprey start coming up, and we have to scramble to save them. And so that's unfortunately one of the sad things is we just don't know they're there in a lot of cases. And juvenile lamprey are super susceptible to predation. These are little worms about this big that are swimming down the river. And you can imagine bass, bluegill, other predaceous fish love them. I want to switch over from fish and talk. I have one amphibian and one reptile to bring up to you guys here. So northern red-legged frog. It's locally very abundant. We have them in lots of our watersheds around here. They're an interesting species. They've kind of been replaced in many areas by bullfrog. And they need low velocity water bodies, ponds, streams, wetlands that have specific temperature and vegetation requirements to allow them to breed. One of the neat things is they don't need permanent water bodies. So about this time of year, they will start their spawn breeding, January, February, lay their egg masses. Oftentimes they have specific vegetation types they like to lay their eggs in. Tadpoles and froglets, the tadpoles hatch out, metamorphose into froglets. By midsummer, those frogs are metamorphosed into adults and they'll leave. If the pond dries up after that, that's fine for them. And that actually works out well. Bullfrogs, one of their main predatory species in the area, has a 2-year life history in the valley. So they require 2 years as a tadpole to become an adult frog. So one of our ways that we conserve northern red-legged frogs is by creating wetlands, areas that will desiccate and will dry out so that we can, and they're not permanent, with the idea that red-legged frogs will make it, but bullfrogs die off. It's one way to control biologically for these guys. Pond turtles is the last one. Lateral habitat connectivity is like super big for pond turtles. They need access to aquatic habitat with basking structures, logs, and other perches they can get on top of and thermoregulate themselves. Very important for them for their ectothermic. So outside, they regulate their temperatures by moving around. Ectothermic means. So they have to have basking structures for their metabolism, basically. They need access to and through floodplain habitats. So they need moist, shrubby, or forested habitats for estivation, which is like in times where it's really hot, these guys will slow down their metabolism to survive. It's called estivation. And also for hibernation, overwintering. And so when it's really cold, they'll slow themselves down. They do that as a way of surviving as well. Limiting factors for them, again, bullfrogs, predatory fish, raccoons, which invade the nests. Non-native turtles, which it might be like, why is a non-native turtle a threat? Well, the non-native turtles we have around here, the red-eared sliders, they start their nesting a couple weeks before northwest pond turtles start their nesting. They use the exact same habitats. And so they go in, and turtles, the habitats they use are, I think I'll go into it in a minute here, but it's typically bare soil near floodplains, near water, but it has to be, this again, disturbance, a disturbed soil where it's kind of bare. There's not a bunch of vegetation or shrubs on it. And they'll go in and they'll urinate on the soil to soften it up and dig out their nest. Well, predators like raccoons know to smell this. And in times of the year where they start breeding, they'll be pretty smelly in those habitats where they're nesting. Well, the red-eared slider comes in a week or two early and starts urinating, making nests, and bringing in all the predators to the area. So that by the time the western pond turtle gets in and starts building its nests, the predators are already there. And so it's an unfortunate interaction between the non-natives and the natives here. Habitat loss of connectivity, and road mortality are also big limiting factors of them. Interesting about pond turtles is they're basically present in habitats around here year-round. So they overwinter up until about April, where they become active. Their active seasons typically around April through September. The rest of the time, they're hibernating in forested habitats or at the bottom of ponds and reservoirs. They'll bury themselves in the mud and just sort of go into a torpor. They nest in that kind of April to May time period. This is for Oregon, for Western Oregon, the nest. Excuse me. Hatchlings will emerge in that April to May time period. Right after that, they begin nesting again. The adults will begin nesting again. Eggs will oftentimes hatch in the nest. So the actual baby turtle come out of its shell, be awake, be alive, be ready to start its life, but they'll stay in the nest for about a year. Most of them do, until they actually will break through that nest and go find waterways. So at that time, they're super vulnerable to predation. Things go find the nest with the little baby turtles in them. They'll dig them up and consume them. They also have certain times of the year, the August-September period, where they'll go into estivation, basically a torpor when it's really hot. So they need connectivity between habitats to make all this possible. So this is just a little diagram here showing pond turtle habitat. The submerged vegetation here, super important for foraging, for adults, for feeding, and for overwintering. They need basking structures. This allows them to thermoregulate Juvenile turtles also hide under it. They need connectivity between habitats, though. So turtles need to be able to exit a pond, have some cover, shrubby brush, kind of native brushes between where their pond is and where they lay their eggs. And so they kind of need sparsely vegetated open areas, oftentimes dry. South facing is kind of their preferred. So south facing banks that get the most sun is kind of their preferred spot for eggs. And then, you know, if it gets hot, they'll actually move into forests and kind of away from ponds altogether to estivate and to go in that topor and for overwintering as well. So need a lot of connectivity between the habitats. If any one of these is missing, the turtle's not going to make it. And so the issue here is one of connectivity. So I kind of want to go through some conceptual kind of response to restoration ideas here. I started the talk and I talked about watershed characteristics, and about how we kind of look at watersheds broadly. I say, oh, there's, how do we talk about the quantity of habitat, the quality of habitat, the location in the watershed your habitat is in, and what we might expect from that location. We also look at other characteristics of watersheds. Is there connectivity within the watershed? Can fish or other organisms go upstream, downstream? How is the quality and the quantity of that habitat, and what kind of predators are around? I kind of think about these things as characteristics of a local watershed. And I pair that with restoration techniques. And I say, okay, if I want to restore a watershed, I only have so many tools in my toolbox to work with, right? What are the techniques, the intensity of those techniques, the scope, the scale, the size that I can do that would make a difference? Is my location in the watershed a location where, if I was doing restoration, would be effective for species? Or am I doing it in a location that doesn't really interact, or species wouldn't interact with other locations? Am I putting a Band-Aid on a problem? Am I fixing a problem once, or am I leading a change into like ecosystem function? Is habitat function restored, or am I just fixing a Band-Aid over a problem? And how long will it take if I make a change? How long will it take for this change to actually become active for species? And, in this model, I would say that these two interactions, they also interact with kind of species life history and the ecology in the valley. So they're not absent of one another. They're also not absent from each other. So watershed characteristics, you should be changing through restoration, watershed characteristics, and those would also go into the life history and needs of species. And all in all, we're trying to engage an individual response. We're trying to change something. Connectivity is missing from this habitat, so I'm trying to take a culvert out and put a open bottom culvert in to get passage. Well, that affects individuals, but we hope that over time there's a population response. That by doing either enough of these, doing one that has enough scale that it changes local conditions, or there's enough of these happening on the landscape that this has a population response for our target organisms. So I kind of want to dive into these in the next couple slides, and these are my last couple slides here, but I want to dive into these a little bit here with an example. And I came up with this at about 4:30 in the afternoon. So I apologize if this seems a little rushed, because I'm like, I need something else in my talk. And this is a location called Diamond Hills Wetland. It's the Willamette Valley National Refuge Complex picked this up in 2024. They, I think, purchased the property. I'm not 100% sure how they acquired it, but acquired it. And so I felt that it was fair game for Fish and Wildlife Service guy to talk about. I've actually never been out here, so I have no idea if how I'm assessing this habitat is correct or not. And this is just used as an example. But you can see here, there's a creek, Pierce Creek, that flows. It actually flows from the right-hand side of the image towards the left. If you were to kind of extend this another half of an image, you hit I-5. And the I-5 corridor, Highway 99 is right past it. This is kind of near Harrisburg. If you guys know where Harrisburg is at, it's part of the Muddy Creek drainage. The Muddy Creek drainage, actually, I think that's one of the next slides here, but Muddy Creek drainage comes out right near Corvallis. And you can see there's a creek. That creek looks pretty stinking straight, like someone has gone through and channelized it at one point in its history. There's some brush around it. I'm going to make an assumption and assume that it's blackberry and not a lot of trees. And we can also see some wetlands out here, some ponds. And whether or not those are permanent or not, I'm not 100% sure. But what I like to do when I'm looking at a habitat, and I'm talking about restoration with someone, I kind of ask myself, okay, for each species, what are my watershed characteristics and how do they relate to the species that I want to target at this site? So I will look big picture and I say, okay, that red dot on the screen, that's where the Diamond Hill wetlands is located. Here's the rest of, local valley. And this is part of Muddy Creek drainage, which flows kind of through here, comes out at Corvallis and enters the river. Um, Water, I know, is pumped into this drainage from around Coburg from the Mackenzie to help with agricultural demands in the area. This creek, however, does not have any water flowing pumped into it. So it's just getting whatever water happens to be coming out of the hill slope. So when I go through this, I would establish clear, defined goals. I know there's cutthroat trout in this habitat or using Pierce Creek, and I want to reestablish connectivity for cutthroat trout. Um, there was historic surveys that had red-legged frogs in the habitat. I want to modify the habitat in such a way that will bring red-legged frogs back or increase the population of red-legged frogs. So some sort of a clear, defined goal based on the current condition and my future conditions. So, but I have to ask myself a bunch of these other questions. What are the broader characteristics of this watershed to the landscape? If I restore red-legged frogs here, is this population going to interact with other nearby populations? Are the other landowners and the management and the valley conducive to what I want to do? Am I going to reestablish connectivity on my property, but downstream a mile, there's a big culvert that doesn't have passage, and therefore me restoring it here has no effect on the population? These are the kind of big picture questions I like to look at as I'm starting to dig into a project. Um, so talking about cutthroat trout, these then on the property itself are some of the things that I would start to ask. And it's based on those limitations I talked about for the species, both the characteristics and these limitations. Um, Cutthroat trout need year-round water. Is it there on Pierce Creek? Is the temperature suitable for cutthroat trout? What about the habitat that's there? Is there habitat complexity now on Pierce Creek that allows cutthroat to be successful? Or is it totally missing? And I'd have to create the habitat and hope they come into it. These are the kind of questions that I would ask myself beginning to look at a restoration project like this. With another species, red-legged frogs and pond turtles, I would ask about these ponds. And I'd say, gosh, these ponds are cool. Red-legged frogs and pond turtles both need these ponds. Are they perennial? Are there basking structures out there which would allow the turtles to be successful? What's the ground like in the areas that I know that turtles want to do their nests? Is it suitable for nesting, or is it like too wet for nesting? Is there an intact riparian zone? Both these species need to, at some point in their years, go into riparian zones. And it's like, well, gosh, on this map, I'm not seeing them. I may flag that and say, well, that's something we need to change. And then I would take these questions and I would kind of build restoration ideas from these. So, okay, these are some of my questions. And if I came and I found out that, gosh, there is no wood in Pierce Creek and there's not a lot of complexity to Pierce Creek, I may say, well, hey, a restoration idea would be come in, put in a wood placement, increase the pool frequency and please increase the complexity of the habitat to help lateral migration of that channel. So it's not just a simple channel, but it's a meander through the floodplain. We know that habitat, the big log, the juveniles will rear under that, and they need it for in summer months. I'd say, oh, maybe there is only one culvert, and maybe we need to replace culverts to get passage in and out of Pierce Creek. And then I might look at the riparian zone and say, well, we know that the cutthroats need that. Here's something we could do on the property. It's going to take time for the plants to grow, but while we're doing these other things, we plant these trees and get them to grow so that we can get this habitat back in shape for cutthroats. Similarly, with red-legged frogs and northwest pond turtles, I'd go through and say, okay, but I'd start asking these questions. Are the pond permanent? Northwest pond turtles would probably need that, but red-legged frogs wouldn't. In fact, if there's bullfrogs present, that would be beneficial to them. So you may be breaking out what species you're looking to create a project around based on some of the characteristics of the habitat type. And so, again, not getting locked into thinking that there's a one size fit all. I want to restore Chinook habitat or I want to restore Western pond turtle, but working within the characteristics of the habitat you already have to identify things that are missing for other species that need conservation. Beyond that, I have, and I hope that everyone gets a chance to actually get this presentation because I put some links at the end here for some resources. Oregon Conservation Strategy, it's a kind of a living document that talks about conservation of non-ESA listed species. And a lot of these are species that grantors, people putting money out for grants are looking for, that are prioritized for conservation, let's put it that way. Similarly, there's a freshwater fish guidebook. It's put out by OSU Press. It's called Field Guide to the Common Fish River Floodplain. Great guide for people who want to learn more about our fish and kind of where they're at and what they do on the floodplain. There's some great lamprey restoration guidebooks out there. There's this website, the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative, and it's PLCI, a lot of people call it. And it's Fish and Wildlife Source website, has tons of great information, local information here on the Willamette on restoring habitats for lamprey. There's Beaver Restoration Guidebook. I didn't talk much about beaver. I kind of hope that Chris is the next talk. He's one of the authors of this guidebook, and it talks about the benefits of and kind of and also problems of trying to live with and around beavers. Because while beavers have tons of benefits on the environment, they can also be kind of a pain in the butt to live around and with because they have different ideas on how habitats should be managed than we do sometimes. Terrific freshwater mussel guidebook. This is out by Xerces Society. The website, Xerces website, has links to it. I'm afraid I didn't put a link here, unfortunately, but terrific guidebooks on conserving mussels, which are becoming more and more identified as species of conservation need here in the Willamette. And with that, I'm just going to leave it here for a minute so people get my email. I talk to a lot of landowners, so in my day-to-day life. So don't be afraid of reaching out if folks have questions or want to run ideas by me. Always happy to do so. So yeah, with that, I will take questions.
Hey, Brian, thank you so much. That was a lot of information, and I'm happy to say that I will be sharing the recording as well as your presentation, if you'd kindly share it with us to everybody attending and those who couldn't be with us today.
More than happy with that, Suzanne.
Excellent. And I do have a question for you in the chat.
Okay.
Somebody was asking what specific vegetation would be needed for the red-legged frogs.
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know it off the top of my head. It's rushes and uh, matchstick. It's a matchstick rush. The genus is Iliocaris. If we want to get down into like nitty gritty, also bulrush. I don't know all of them off the top of my head. I'm so sorry. There's if the person emails me, I'm happy to look it up.
Excellent. I will share
Yeah.
your email. There was a question about sharing your email address, and if that's okay with you, I'll do that as well.
Yeah, please do so. Please do so.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, we have a question in the room.
Go for it.
What's the status of the Detroit Reservoir drawdown, and what's the desired outcome of that drawdown if it goes in effect?
Oh God. This is that's the drawdown. I haven't read the Capitol Press this week or the Oregonian, so I'm not sure if it has changed. Obviously, the desired effect of the drawdowns is to move fish. It's for passage. It's to move fish downstream. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns about the drawdowns, the effect to the local habitat, the effect to the economy, the effect downstream on city, state, and water supply, other infrastructure downstream. I am not an expert on it, to be 100% honest with you, but it is. I know it's one that's of concern both for the Corps of Engineers, for the other federal agencies that are permitting them to work through, and for our local partners. City of State and City of Detroit, City of Salem. Everyone's concerned about it and talking about it. So I am sorry I don't have a better answer for you on that. I'm kind of glad that's not 100% my wheelhouse. Sorry, I don't have more.
We have another question here at Jefferson.
Yeah.
Yeah, during the presentation, you mentioned drying out creek beds to deal with bullfrogs. Are there other creative ways that people are dealing with bullfrogs to make room for the red-legged frog?
Yes, and not drying out creek beds necessarily, but there's an awful lot of man-made ponds in the valley that are permanent water bodies where bullfrogs do really well. And those are the ones we're talking about. And it's only select ones. Obviously, a lot of other fish, a lot of other creatures utilize these ponds. So it's select ones where you're not necessarily impacting something else is where we're saying, well, that might be a target one to do restoration on red-legged frogs at, because it's one where we can knock down population of bullfrogs and not have a huge effect otherwise. Because we're not talking about drying up creeks, because that's, I don't even know heck how you'd go about doing that, at least with the scale of work that we're working at. But we are talking about at those locations where there are managed waters in ponds and wetlands, there are some opportunities to do that to get the red-legged frogs back on the landscape.
Well, I will go ahead and ask a couple questions about pond turtles. One is, are Western pond turtles on the endangered species list at this time? And then what do turtle nests look like?
Oh yeah, no. Endangered species turtles were petitioned for listing on an ESA. They had positive 90-day finding, which is kind of the first step on the endangered species list. They had a positive 12-month finding, which is kind of the next step to saying the species needs protections under the Endangered Species Act. The final listing has not come out yet, and it's one that folks are actively working on and assessing at this point. And I can't tell you if they are going to become an endangered species or not, but it's one they're being evaluated to potentially be an endangered species. Oh, and that nests. Nests I only recently found out what they look like. They're essentially about the size of a golf ball. If you can imagine what a golf ball looks like, and they have a plug on them. So they're dug out on the ground. And typically it's easy to find them, or easier to find them if you kind of know where to look, which is, like I say, south-facing slopes. Within 100 meters of pond, they can be up to 500 meters away from a pond or waterway where turtles are at. Outside of the high water area, they don't want to get flooded. Areas that have very little vegetation or have sparse vegetation, so not areas that are like covered in grass, for instance, but areas that are kind of bald. And they're about that golf ball size hole. The area around it will be wetted down. You can tell it has been wetted down from the turtle urinating on it. And then once they lay the eggs, they actually cover it back up with mud. So about maybe, oh gosh, half an inch down, maybe more, you'll see a plug of mud that has been pushed into that hole to cover it up. That keeps the eggs moist. And I'm not an expert on it, to be honest. I have found a couple, and I was totally happy when I did. But there are some trained turtle people out there who can spot them that are way better than me.
Gotcha. Thanks, Brian. And then let's do the last two questions about bullfrogs. Somebody was wondering about managing for great blue heron to help control bullfrogs. And the other questions, I think, is regarding whether it's a problem to have bullfrogs on your property or not.
Bullfrogs are ubiquitous. It's like saying, is it a problem to have blackberry on your property? It's like, my God, everyone has blackberry. Everyone who has water has bullfrogs. They're just sort of there on the landscape. There's opportunities to get rid of bullfrogs. There was an interesting project up in British Columbia, which is kind of the edge of the range locally where bullfrogs can make it. And they're able to eradicate islands of bullfrogs. And it's like, well, that's great, because they're able to kind of keep those islands once they got established, eradicate them, and then keep them off the island. That's perfect. As far as eradicating them locally, there's some opportunities, but I've seen an ecosystem kind of rebound from having bullfrogs and go back to native amphibians after eradication. But it takes a lot of work, and it takes sustained work to keep the bullfrogs out, either through management, like draining them, or through persistent trapping. Or I've seen people shoot bullfrogs before. I have no idea if these or gig them. There's like little tridents they go out and catch bullfrogs with. I don't know how effective these are, to be terribly honest. But other people have other ways of managing them, and at least knocking down their numbers. because the largest bullfrogs are the ones that are biggest problem with predation. And so if you can kill those ones, you're limiting that, but then you always have a younger generation kind of coming.
Gotcha. And the great blue herons, are they a good control?
Oh, it's an awesome idea. Great blue herons. I'm not sure how many bullfrogs great blue heron can eat, but hey, I say more the merrier.
Excellent.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Jordan. I am a fish biologist in title. I am not a real fish biologist like Brian. We just heard from a real fish biologist who knows all things about fish and turtles and frogs. I work for the National Marine Fisheries Service. I'm based in Corvallis and in Newport, and I work on river habitat for salmon and steelhead. So ESA listed fish across the West Coast. And I want to talk to you today, sort of build on what Brian was talking about, is what are healthy rivers? What are healthy rivers and streams? And do we really even know what they look like? And if we're going to do restoration, what are we aiming for? And Brian talked about it in terms of what do fish and frogs and turtles need out of the habitat. If it's broken and we're going to do something about it, we need to have a target. What are we going to make? What do we want to make it look like? And so I want to talk you through how much we know about what that should look like, and what are the things to keep in mind if you want to do that kind of work. All right, let's see if I can make this move. One thing I didn't check was how to make the slides. I made the first slide up, but after that, okay, how about this? All right, there we go. All right, so I think everyone would agree. If we're gonna have like the first couple slides is sort of like a test. Does this look good or bad? This is a really easy one in terms of there's a lot of things here that jump to our mind of not a happy stream or a river. We've got sort of this cut bank. It looks like the river is cutting into or is below this surface. There's not a lot of stuff in the middle of the river. There's no wood. There's no beaver dams. The vegetation around the stream is it's either sort of weedy, disturbed, or it's grass that's clearly a pasture area. And so there's probably a lot that could be done here. That's not an interesting thing to look at. What's interesting is that a place like this. So there was grazing here. Grazing is not here now, or at least not as really high duration, high intensity, short duration, a really healthy grazing plan here. So the grazing is not an issue. There's really no development. There's one little road you can see off on the right there. But I would argue that this is not a very healthy system. This stream is downcut in sort of like a ditch. There's a tiny little riparian area. This is the only place where you see vegetation that's making use of the water of that stream. And so it's a really simplified system. But it doesn't have a lot of the things that we normally associate, like, oh, it's easy to say that that's disturbed because I can see human activity or the footprint of human activity. You can't see that here, but it is a simplified system. What about this one? There's a lot of vegetation. I don't see any kind of disturbance here, except my eye, this is a sad creek. It's a bowling alley kind of straight. The vegetation is all the same. If you tell by the surface of the water, you can how wiggly the surface is. That tells you what's the substrate like. What are the cobbles and gravel that's on the bottom? It's all the same. So this is a plain bedded channel. There's no ups and downs in the bottom. There's no sorting of sediment into sand, a pile of sand over here, or a pile of rocks and boulders, cobbles over here. So this is a simplified system, but it has a lot of other things that we might jump on and say, cool, riparian vegetation, maybe shade. I don't see any cows or roads, things that I might associate with the factors that might lead to a disturbed system. But I think this is a pretty simplified disturbed system. This one, Now we have a lot of trees. So we have a forest, we have a riparian forest. But we have one species of tree, and it's completely shading out everything else underneath it.
Alders.
Yeah, this is red alder, this has been the Hallam, before that was the Asotin, before that was Bridge Creek. So these are local, not local to the Willamette, but streams you can get to in probably 8 hours per so. In an 8-hour drive, you can visit all these places. And these are not happy places, but they have a lot of stuff in them that we would associate with healthy river systems. Dense canopy closed riparian forest here. But this is just a single ditch-like stream and very little diversity in the plants because it's dominated by one tree, sort of this early succession, the tree that comes in first after it's disturbed. What about this one? This is a wiggly ditch, I call it. This is the result of restoration. So someone saw this stream and said, I am now going to fix it. And this is what has resulted from the fixing. And so all of those pictures, whether it's in the desert, whether it's in the mountains, on the edge of the Rockies, in the Blue Mountains to the Rockies transition, whether it's in the Coast Range, or here, this sad stream, these are much more like ditches than they are like rivers. The channels are simplified. There's a single threaded channel. It doesn't connect well with the land around it. It's isolated. The example in the desert stream, the stream was cut down so far that it can't be connected. The stream, the Asotin, was locked in with the vegetation, so it can't move around, it can't get out. Same thing with the upper Nehalem there. And then this one here, this is George Creek. It's been put in this place, but it ejects. Every few years it ejects and it completely does away with this restoration. And another several $100,000 are poured back into this bed to put the stream back. So the stream is telling us something here, that it wants to look like this. It wants to not be a stream. It wants to be what we call a river corridor or a riverscape. We don't even have the words for it. That's the problem. When we say stream or river, what's in our mind and what's in our vocabulary are a single channel that's different from the land around it. But what things used to look like, it was hard to tell where the river and the land ended until you got to here, right where the land started to get steep and dry and moved up. And that's clearly, this here is land. This is river. And we don't have that word because we have for so long stolen this land from this river. We call it floodplain as if it's different, but it's not. It's really all part of the river. So what I want to talk about, I want to explore is this idea that if we can reimagine, or why is it that we've got stuck in this simplified world? And what do we do if we're going to try to embrace that in restoration? Now, I completely acknowledge that it's not possible to make these riverscape-like places everywhere, because we industrial humans, have found it really convenient for these flat places that rivers made. We put our roads there, because it's a lot easier to make the roads. We farm there, and as Brian said, because this material that the river deposited over thousands to millions of years is really rich soil. That's all that organic material. And so it's flat, and it's productive, but it's the rivers. And so when we're doing restoration, we have to have this conversation. How much are we going to take, and how much are we going to get back? All right, so why is it that we think of rivers as lines, not ribbons? Even on our maps, we have thin blue lines for rivers, when really it's that valley bottom that we should be naming and identifying on maps and pictures as rivers. What do rivers need? How are rivers ribbons, not lines? Well, there's kind of three things that rivers need. Rivers need space. They need to have that space. They built that space, and we've taken it away. So they need that to be healthy. They need regimes. They need wood. They need sediment. They need water. All of those things have to be coming in order in order for them to be healthy. Let's see if I can do this. Yeah. And they need stuff in the way. And this is what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about, is the stuff that used to be in rivers that makes them complicated, that makes them messy, makes them inconvenient for us. It makes them inefficient conveyors of water. So I use the word ditch for impaired rivers, because a ditch is meant to move water. We have made most of our rivers and streams into ditches. They're really good at moving water. And if that might be intentional, they're moving water because they're moving goods. Brian talked about them as being transport networks, or moving water away because we want to dry the land, dry that area, or worry about flooding, and we want to push the water downstream, which is really just giving the flood problem to our neighbors. Natural, healthy systems are inefficient. The water doesn't move as fast. It stays there. And Brian talked about, well, you get better nutrient cycling. You can be more productive if you keep the water around. And I want to show you some examples of that. Okay, so healthy rivers need space. They need regimes. They're going to need wood. They're going to need sediment. They're going to need water. And they're messy. Okay, that was simple. Why is it so hard for us to see, right? Here is the stream before it gets reconnected to its floodplain, or it's a single-threaded channel. It's green in the desert, so gives a thumbs up for healthy, but when it's really healthy, it's really connected and really wet. And in this case, the restoration was beaver sprinkler, adding beaver, or encouraging beaver to be there, and they made it this complicated, inefficient, connected thing. So why? Why do we have a hard time seeing rivers for what they should and can do? Brian introduced the river continuum concept, sort of the basis, the first figure in a textbook about rivers. If you were going to go get an academic degree about river biology, you would start there. This is how rivers work. I think this is how ditches work, because the people who thought about rivers working this way, being continuous, are working on systems that are already impaired. All the wood is gone from the rivers by the time people were imagining how rivers work. All the beavers were gone from the landscape. The things that naturally made messes out of rivers were gone. And so when the pointy-headed academics said, this is how rivers work, they were describing how ditches work. But they were using the word river because they thought they were rivers. An alternative view is to put the mess back in there and then ask the question, how do these systems work? And in that case, you end up with this picture on the right, which is the river discontinuum concept, which is the fact that the rivers are made up of lots of little bits. They're little bits up in the headwaters, and they're little bits down at the bottom and where it's big, and they're broken up into complicated little pieces because there's stuff in the way. And this is the river continuum concept is something that people talk about. The river discontinuum concept is they avoid because it's inconvenient. So that's one. The other is, I just want to get rid of this. The other thing is we in the river world have given control of the description of rivers to the physical scientists. And the biologists have just said, oh, you all will figure it out. I don't know if it's because it's too complicated or because they got to it first. But as a result, the idea that rivers are dominated by their moving water, the hydrology, and the geology, the landscape, the stuff that's in the sediment that's in the river. All the descriptions of rivers have those two parts. And if you just have those two parts, you get ditches. Because the water moves, and it's heavy, it's sticky, and because of gravity, it's got a lot of energy, and it moves through the geology, which means it grabs stuff and takes it away. Which means it digs a ditch. That's all that happens if you let geology and hydrology be the things that define how rivers work. If you add biology, which is at the top of the screen here, biology hasn't been let into that conversation. But if you put biology into that mix, biology is a process, energy from the sun, captured, turned into larger organic molecules that build stuff, that build plants and build animals, that repair and reproduce. That is the resistance. That's what's fighting the hydrology. That's what's fighting the moving water. And that's what's replacing or slowing down the continual just removal of stuff, erosion. We don't live on a billiard ball, we live in this bumpy thing because water and air have grounded away. And the only place where it's growing back is on the biology side. So if we put biology back in to let it be part of the description of rivers, we get a really different picture about how rivers work and how we should be restoring them. We don't talk about changing their shape. We talk about sticking biological stuff in them and let it work, let it do work. What does that look like? So here is a creek. And here's a creek that has biology. In this case, it has a beaver dam. And what's happened here is you have this enormous vertical complexity because water's been piled up. Water would have run downhill here and dug out this ditch, except this pile of sticks put in by a couple of industrious rodents stopped that water moving. And it piled it up. And so back here you have a big pile of water, which results in pressure, which pushes water down into the ground, and it pops out someplace else. It also builds up potential energy. It stores a bunch of energy up here, more than there was before. So when it makes it around, like on the edges, it has more energy to exert on the ground. And so it digs. But it only digs right there. It doesn't dig everywhere. But it's not digging over here, and it's not digging up here, which means you have fast and slow water in the same place, because biology was added. If you didn't have this biology in the middle, you would have that picture of the Asotan, where everything was uniform. It came to some balance of everything that the water could pick up, it took away. And the things it couldn't pick up, it left behind. That is not the case. That's in the continuous case. Here's the discontinuous case. Right here, where there's like little jets, yeah, big stuff is being carried away. Right here, where there's slack water, little stuff is falling and staying. So now you have a diversity of stuff, even if it's geologic stuff, because you have a diversity of hydrology, that's moving water. And why do you have that diversity? Because biology got in the way. And that's piling it up, that's vertical. The same thing happens, let's look at some data. So what I claim is that if you have this stuff in the way, then you slow everything down because you've got a lot of water slowed down here, maybe it speeds up here, maybe it slows down here. And we're back to what Brian said is it's a good thing to have water slow down. Well, can beaver really do that? Could some complexity, could some just something in the way slow water down? And the answer is yes. And here's a really simple case, and this is something that's done by Julia Bryce, who's a grad student at LSU in forestry. And this is in the Cook Creek, which is in the Blue River drainage in the Mackenzie. And this is a stream. This is Cook Creek here. There's some pictures on the left. Going across this boundary, here's an old growth forest that's never been harvested. And here's a second growth forest that was harvested about 60 years ago. As that stream flows through that transition from old growth to Cook Creek, it kind of looks the same. Here it is in the second growth. You have lots of alders. You can see the stream, lots of big boulders. And here's that same stream just, like 100 yards upstream in that old growth forest. Nothing has been done in the stream. There's no restoration, there's no disturbance. The trees have been removed, and they're removed 60 years ago, and it's been 60 years without trees, and now they're growing, the plantation's growing back up. Here's a place where the trees have been there for 400 or 500 years. And as a result, there's big dead trees in the creek. The big dead trees are biology that's gotten in the way. And there's lots of little sediment, small-sized things that have been able to stop, been dropped off there because the water moves more slowly when it has to go up and over this. Okay, I'm just telling you the water's moving more slowly. If if, and this is what Julia's done, is put salt in the water and then measure that salt farther downstream. And you can do that really easy. So what she did, and this is in the summer when the water is moving pretty slowly, and this is the same thing in the winter when this water is moving fast. This is just 200 meters, 2 football fields. Drop the salt in, detect the saltiness downstream. The red lines are the second growth, this more ditch-like stream. In the summer, you drop in the salt, and in about 60 minutes, about an hour, you first detect some of that salt. About an hour and a half, it's really salty, and then by 3 hours, 4 hours later, it's all gone, back to fresh water. Go downstream a little bit in the old growth where it's just messier stream. Do the same thing. Drop the salt in. It takes 100 minutes before you start to get any detection. It takes almost 3 hours before that peak shows up. And then here, 10 hours later, you're still getting salty water. The same pattern happens when you have high flow. It just moves really fast. It's just sped up. 12 minutes in on the second growth versus like 18 minutes in, that front of salt is moving through. So more water, less water, same story. It takes twice as long for water to move through this messy, bumpy place than it does for this still looking pretty good, but lots of connectivity. And this is the difference between the continuum and the discontinuum. And that's how important even just a little bit of stuff is in the stream. That's changing the time it takes. It's doubling the time it takes water to just go 200 meters. Same thing happens if we ask laterally. What happens left and right if you put biology, in this case beavers? This is the same place I showed the picture before. We were just looking at the bottom of this beaver dam right here. Now if we get up in a drone and look back at this field where beavers have come in, the blue area, that's what the creek used to look like. That's what the ditch was. This is Birch Creek. This is in southeast Idaho, right near the Utah and Wyoming, where the 3 states come together. This is what the creek looked like as it went through this pasture area before beaver. And then the yellow dotted line is basically what you have to say is the creek now that you've added beaver. You've added biology. So it spreads water laterally. This is storage space. This is part of the slowing down. So there's just more wet area by adding mess in the stream. So vertical and lateral connectivity of the area of the land next to the river. And that's what we have lost, that's what we're missing with this simplified view that rivers are just geology and hydrology, and that channels should be clean, and that rivers should be ditches. They shouldn't. They should be this fully connected wet area. And if it's not really wide, it can still be piled up. And that's still adding a lot of value. So think about that in your repertoire of what might you do if you're entertaining ideas of restoration. Let's look at how that plays out in a couple of examples of restoration. This is Dottie Ravine Creek, which is a tributary in the upper, it's in the Sacramento, it's in the Sacramento, near Chico in the Central Valley of California. This is a cow pasture, and the landowner wanted to add more complexity to Dottie Ravine Creek, but still keep cows, run cows on their pasture. And so a certain amount of the area was given to the potential for restoration. This PS, or this process space, that's as wide as Dottie Ravine Creek was before the restoration started. And the restoration action there was really just to add beaver. They had to set back levees because Dottie Ravine was constrained to be just this wide, with levees to hold the water in place to keep the pasture dry. Levees were set back to make this much process space, but the water is just not going to go solve that problem itself. Something has to get in the way. And the first thing, and actually it's a sort of a fun story, set back the levees, then went to get permits and funding to do a physical meandering of the stream. And that took a couple of years. And while they were doing that, the beaver came in and said, now I have some space. I'm going to put mess in the way. and spread the water out, which is what the bulldozers might have done, but it didn't require permits or a grant. And what happened here is this interaction between the physics of moving water and the biology of wet ground. And that's, again, the sort of tension between you have the physics and you have the biology. You have to think about sort of putting the two of them together to get to an intact system. So what does that look like in this case? So the first thing that happened was water was spread out. A couple beaver dams were built and water spread laterally. That water did biological work. That allowed all these willows to grow where they couldn't before, there was just grass. All of those willows growing rob energy from moving water. There's just stuff in the way. That drops more sediment, more silt and clays and sand out of the water, which builds up the soil, which adds to slowing down the water. So that's geomorphic work. That vegetation did geomorphic work. It robbed energy from the flow. Once you dropped energy from the flow, you made more plant habitat. So there are more plants, and then you get more biological work. And you get this feedback, this connection between the biology and the physics. And that's how systems repair themselves. If there's a flood that washes out the vegetation, or if there's a big deposit of sediment that's going to grow more vegetation, that continual dynamic play between the physics and the biology is what make these systems build themselves and repair themselves. So in this case, just letting the biological work get started then could overwhelm the physics of water and do geomorphic work, and it kept going. Here's an example. This is in Bridge Creek, which is in the John Day, near Mitchell, near Painted Hills, where the biological work was beaver dams. The stream was too incised and too tight, and so the geomorphic work was too strong. There's too much energy in the stream for the beaver dams, and all of the dams kept getting blown out. And so the intervention in this case was to reinforce the dams to actually see if they would last. And what we did is just build fake beaver dams, a few of them, to give a leg up to the biology. That allowed the biology to stay in touch with the geology, with the geomorphic, the work of all the water. And you ended up with that picture I showed you where you get the beaver taking over the stream. The restoration there was not to make the system. The restoration was to try to get the biology in touch with the physics. Okay, a couple more examples of that and then I'll stop. This is White Shoes Creek, which is near Sisters, just on the other side of the Cascades. It doesn't look much like a creek. These are berms of gravel from some mining, some moving sediment around to control the water flow, and taking a bunch of the water out. So the water didn't have anywhere enough energy to deal with the shape of the valley that we've given it. So the restoration was, let's just spread it out. Let's even out the valley floor and let the water now have the right amount of energy for its space. It looks like a mess. So here's the valley before, which is hard to tell. There's a creek in that. Here is after the restoration, which is just sort of spread everything out, and the water is just everywhere. And that looks like a mess to us because we're not familiar with seeing water having all of its land back. Right. And the vegetation's not used to that either because it hasn't been there a long time. But you give it a little more time, just a year, and it starts growing back up. It starts reconnecting. So, now I want to ask the question, because when projects like this happen, when you get this water spread out, the first reaction, mostly from people in my profession, fish biologists, is say that's going to get too hot, and the water's too shallow and spread out. That can't possibly be good fish habitat. So let's ask that question. Is it better fish habitat after we spread the water out? And let's ask that question just from a physics standpoint. I'm not even going to ask what the fish want. Brian told you all the things the fish want. I don't know what fish want. But I think I can say we're delivering things where fish will be happy to be. This is the colors on this map have to do with how fast the water is moving. And how fast the water is moving is being predicted by a model, a math model for water moving. Before the restoration, all of the water is confined to a small amount of area because there's just that channel. And because that water, the same amount of water is moving in a small amount of area versus a big amount of area, it has to go faster. And if we look over here to decode what the colors mean, anything that's sort of yellow and red is above 1 foot per second. And if you want a rule of thumb, little fish, whether it's a lamprey or a dace or a salmon or a trout, water moving faster than 1 foot per second, they're going to have a hard time moving around. So anything that's red is bad. Anything that's in the cooler colors is good. If we look at the flow, this is a 2-year flow. So this is the flow that happens every other year. All of White Shoes Creek is not little fish habitat before the restoration. After the restoration, by spreading the water out, all of White Shoes Creek, except for a couple little hotspots, is fish habitat. And there's a lot more of them. So it's more, and it is more likely a place that a little fish could survive without being blown away by spreading it out. 100-year flow event. This is something that happens once a century. Yeah, really big fire hose in the pre-restoration, but yeah, the water's getting up and out of the ditch, and there's a few places that little fish can survive. When the water is given back to the whole valley, even in a 100-year flow event, the little fish are still there. There are still places where a juvenile red band trout or steelhead could just be hanging out, waiting out a 100-year flow event if the river had all its land, which I think is pretty amazing. Same thing is you can ask the same question for adults, and what this says up here on the top of the slide is adult habitat. And if we look at this area, which is where most of the steelhead spawning happened in this creek, and trout spawning happened in this creek, and ask, when the eggs are in the ground, will they withstand a high flow? And this is a 1.5-year event. This is something that happens. This is a flow that happens all the time. Now, rather than asking the velocity and how fast the water is moving, we're asking how much energy is being transferred to the bottom. So water moving over a surface can grab things and pick it up. That's taking the energy in the moving water, and it's just like rubbing your hand against your other hand. There's a little bit of friction. You can feel, when I rub my right hand on my left hand, I can feel that I'm doing that because it pulls a little bit. If my left hand fell apart, and when I read by here, it would grab pieces and take it away. And that's exactly what happens with water moving over gravel or sand. If it's moving fast enough and has enough, transferring enough energy, it picks it up and moves it. And that's how it takes things away. If we ask what size particle would move with the water moving like that, yellow on this figure here is like gravel, and red is cobble. So big things like this big. So what this says is in this area, which is good spawning habitat, more than once every 2 years, every bit of cobble that was on the bottom of that bed was picked up and moved somewhere else. You think about what lamprey and salmon do, about right now, February to April, they're digging reds and putting their eggs, putting their bedding on the next generation in that gravel and cobble. Every time there's a flow, a little peak of flow that's bigger than the yellow or the red, the gravel to the cobble, it's going to pick stuff up and move it away. So this is 2015, a pretty wet year. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times when all the gravel would have been rearranged, and there were at least 3 times when all the cobble would have been rearranged. This is the time when all of those eggs are in the ground. This flow, something just every other year, means complete reproductive failure for the fish that are in that area, because all of those eggs have been churned up, the reds have been destroyed. What happens after the restoration when we spread the water out? So here's the same thing. That's just taking the color scheme of how fast the water is moving and turning it into what size particle would it move. And this is that spawning area now that the water has been moved out. And there's all these patches where the water is below the gravel mobilization energy. Which means if there were a red here, it might get removed. If there was a red here, it might not. Over here in this pre-restoration, there's very little area where it might not get moved. And so changing the physics just by slowing the water down, either by spreading it out or piling it up, takes these environments and makes them into things that are more likely to be fish habitat. And I want to end by just showing some pictures of ditches that are turned into rivers. This is 5 Mile Creek, which is out on the coast, just north of the Umpqua. Drains into Silk Goose Lake, I think. And this is the 5 Mile as a ditch here. Here's 5 Mile where it's been given back its entire valley floor. This is immediately after the restoration of just spreading the water out. And this is about 10 years later when the willow just respond and take it over. This is the same amount of water. This is not magic. This is that creek when it is in a ditch. This is the creek when it's allowed to be in contact with the entirety of its surface. And this is what that water does, especially in the Oregon coast where stuff grows year-round. This is 15-foot high willow gallery as a result of just letting the water have its space back. This is Finn Rock in the middle of the Mackenzie up by Vida. This is an old gravel mine, abandoned gravel mine that's in the middle of the channel. So the main stem of the Mackenzie's over here. This is sort of off-channel habitat, bullfrog habitat, because it's a warm, and bass, a warm pond. And the Forest Service and Mackenzie River Trust and the Watershed Council did this to it, which has put 1/5 of the Mackenzie water back in this area. Another way of saying that is giving 80% of the valley back to the Mackenzie. And this is now where the Chinook are spawning.
How'd you get all the water over?
So a lot of changing of the topography happened in order to do this. So what's left of the gravel mines here, all of the material that had the spoils that have been piled up there have been moved. They've been piled up down here, they've been spoiled over here, but the surfaces have been lowered to reconnect them with the river here, letting the water in. Water comes into the project here and goes out down here, and this is Finn Rock and the boat landing down there, if you're familiar with the middle Mackenzie. This is just giving space, taking a ditch and turning it into a river. This is Bridge Creek that I talked about, where we gave a leg up to the beaver to take Bridge Creek ditch and turn it into Bridge Creek Riverscape, where it's in contact with its floodplain. This is the South Fork Mackenzie. Same kind of thing. This is below Cougar Dam. There's just a couple miles of the South Fork, the last mile before the confluence with the main stem Mackenzie. It's been given back. The floodplain's been given back to the river. And you can tell that from space. This is just a drone. But you can see the fluffiness of the water because there's fast and slow water because there's stuff in the way. There's trees in the way. We don't allow trees over here because this is a recreation area. And this is just a balance we're going to have to make to have restoration in some places, but not everywhere. This is the Mackenzie above, this is the South Fork Mackenzie above that restoration project, right on the bridge, the bridge, if you're driving to Cougar, not to the bottom of the dam, but the top of the dam, on that road, you look down the South Fork Mackenzie, there's someone fishing in what I think is a ditch. Because if they give the same water back, and the Forest Service did this project, they gave that water back to the floodplain, it looks like this. And there's a mile across of that. Well, you just give the water back to the land that it made to start with. And so how do we do that at a small scale? How do we do it at a big scale? How do we have those conversations as a society about where is it okay and to what extent to, in a sense, return the land? And let the biology have a part of this conversation about what rivers do. They're not just geology and hydrology. Okay. It's probably a different version of how rivers work, that you may have heard before. And it takes a lot of agreement to try to allow that to happen in a restoration context. And that's what your watershed councils are there for, to help and try to manage what are those opportunities. And no opportunity is too small. And clearly, the bigger they get, the more expensive, the more involved it is, but the more impactful that it can be. So yeah, I realize we don't have a lot of time for questions. I also am happy to provide my contact and carry on these conversations outside of this forum.
Just want to say thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that okay if I speak?
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I just want to say thank you so much. That was so beautifully presented and something that is so needed, being an ecological and working with children for over 30 years. We call it the artificial river. You know, we've always called it artificial because it is not biology. And what you presented truly is a biological river continuum. A continuum has bumps and pauses, so to call it a what was it called?
Discontinuum.
It is not a discontinuum. The other one is, was more of a discontinuum. Yeah. So I think that the verbiage is so important.
Yeah, the words,
that is a true.
That
is a true continuum. I mean, I love Jean Lidoff's work. She worked with humans in Africa about the continuum concept. And so, yes, I just wanted to put that. Think about that wording. That is a true continuum.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question here in Jefferson.
Go for it.
I have enjoyed the first 2 meetings in this course. I've gotten a lot of information that is very valuable. None of it is applicable to what I came for. I appreciate it all, and I've enjoyed it, and I would love everything you've said, but it has nothing to do with my 50 acres. And there's people in this room, when we went around how much acreage we had, nobody had the kind of lands that you guys have all been talking about. So it does not help us plan for pardon me, I'll just speak for myself. It's not helping me plan for my land. It shows me what a wonderful job you're doing, but it's like a fancy brochure, not helpful planning for my property. And I'm sorry for the criticism, but if you don't know, if I can't criticize what I'm doing, I can't get the information I need.
Yeah, it's not criticism. It's the reality that we as a society have made changes, and we're all part of that system where we have parcels that are not entire ecosystems. Yeah. But I think there's still things that can be done. Connectivity happens at really small scales. Brian talked about edge habitat on the edge of creeks and rivers, one bank, one side, letting water into that area, either infiltrating through the groundwater or actually letting water on the surface. Any kind of elaboration is biologically beneficial. Yes, it'd be great if you could contain the entire life cycle of a cutthroat trout on your property. Very few people have that opportunity. So we can't talk about that as strategies, but we can talk about small pieces that can be done that contribute. That's one. The other, I heard a talk by Jane Lubchenko on OSU campus the other day. She's a policy person, a scientist who went to Washington for 20 years to do policy. And she came back to talk about that. And a student asked her the question, okay, I'm a graduate student in civil engineering. What do I do with my life and my training as a student in order to be most impactful, making an impact in the world going forward? And her answer, I thought, was great. She said, okay, if you think about climate change, as an individual, okay, maybe you turn the lights out. Well, that's really not going to make any difference. So what about if you, and she didn't say it exactly this way, I'm paraphrasing it, what about if you could get 100 people to change their behavior? Or what about if you could teach 100 people to teach another 100 people to change their behavior? How do you amplify the message? And so you doing work on the land that you have and having it as a demonstration, having it as a way that you can engage people in your community about how to collectively make changes. Because lots of 50-acre parcels banding together can make meaningful change. How do you build that collective? How do you build that collaboration? Someone's got to jump first. That's the scariest bit. And then they have to be willing to share the fact that they took a risk. So I think there's a lot of value in the small steps, but if those small steps can be intentionally part of a bigger thing. We individually cannot solve these problems. And how do we work together? And I think that's what the watershed councils are trying to do, is be that clearinghouse. But it does start with all of you of being willing to take that risk, and not only just take the risk, but willing to show off the fact that you've taken the risk, which is even scarier. So thank you for even entertaining the possibility of it.
Thanks, Chris. And I see we have a hand up in the Marys River Watershed Council room.
Yes, we do. Good time.
Yeah.
So I want to say thank you again. I have a much smaller piece of land, just a couple acres attached to a family member, my parents, who also have a couple of acres. But I really appreciate all the information, because I feel like it gives little bits of information and inspiration for how what species the land probably used to support and maybe could support again. And I totally hear the last person that not all those bits of information are going to help every piece of land, but I appreciate that today I think red-legged frogs are probably something that used to use our property, and we still have frogs. And I've taught biology for years and had students plant on greenbelt sites, and so I've seen some of those big restorations that I feel like today I really got some ideas for the little things that maybe could happen with our property. So appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, that is more than enough footprint to do a project. I mean, Scott from the Marys River and I are going to go tomorrow morning out to a 3-acre parcel where, you know, we're in the middle of doing a restoration project with high school students from the Marys River Youth Watershed Council, and the footprint of the project is 3 acres. And it's stuff that high school students did by hand. The work that's happening tomorrow is a couple professional sawyers that are not giving chainsaws to the high school students. But on Monday, they're going to come back and they'll plant willow stakes. And we're going to transform the bottom end of that tributary by hand on a very small scale. And if there were lots of those things done, that would add to the capacity of storing water in a really flashy system that suffers from a lot of water moving into a ditch-like channel that has the potential to do damage. But if we can slow the water down at the scale of 3 acres at a time, that can add up. And so I'm hoping that that project can be a bit of a demonstration, and the fact that on industrial timberland where that can't be logged anymore because it's in the riparian management zone, but it can be managed for healthy riverscapeness. And it can be done by hand, by high school students, on the weekend.
Thank you, Chris. I think I'm not sure if there's anyone else with questions. I think we might entertain 1 or 2 more if there are any. Okay, well, I'm gonna wrap it up then, and thank you, Brian, and thank you, Chris, for your presentations. I've learned so much myself, and I'm grateful, even though I have the flu and I have to be home, I'm grateful that I could join in and hear you online. And I will be sending out, or we will be sending out the emails that you get a couple days afterwards. By Friday, you'll have be able to view the presentations recordings, and also have access to the the homework assignments that are on the Google Drive that we share with you, as well as some additional resources and some of the things that Chris and Brian shared today will be included, including their contact information. So thank you all for attending tonight, and we will see you again next week for our third session. Goodbye, everybody.
I thought that was wonderful.